Hello once again from the Prim Reaper. Following the last topic in this series, altruism is a subject I feel is very closely related, but has many more layers to it and plays out differently depending on the exact flavor of social justice you may be talking about. That subject is the sheer level of looking down your nose, maximum strength guilt that many aspects of this ideology will levy at people they deem to not belong to one of the many oppressed classes. More than that, the guilt levied at people even perceived to be against their cause, oppressed class or not. Once again, this is a very complex subject with a number of branches to it, so I'll try and explore it in at least somewhat of a logical order. First, there is a reason I wanted to link this topic and the previous video relatively closely together, and that reason is as follows. I mentioned before how many people who are taken in by social justice narratives will do so because of high levels of altruism and empathy for others. I feel this topic is essentially another side of the same coin. There's a difference between wanting to improve things for a group because you purely want to make their situation better, altruism, and wanting to improve things for a group because you are guilted into doing so because you supposedly owe them in some way for some perceived slight, past or present, guilt. In this sense, I think that the ideology can really work at people in different ways and have varying kinds of success in attracting followers based on these different strategies. However, as I already mentioned, I feel like guilt has a little bit more to it than the latter subject, and so I'd like to try to break it down into smaller, more specific topics. First, there is of course the examples of guilt that people bring down upon others as a result of belonging to a certain group, usually one that is deemed to be privileged or to have power over others. I've already talked about this a little bit in the earlier videos in this series, particularly the video on divisiveness, but this was more on a broader level of separation and hierarchy. The guilt aspect, I find, is a little bit more pernicious in that it often acts in some ways subtle and some ways not, that people should in some way feel guilty not about their actions, but about mere group membership. And of course, the thing about group membership in this context is that it's rarely a membership that anyone chose, such as being white or male. It may, and in fact I would say often does, have a historical element to it, like blaming modern-day white people for slavery or modern-day men for historical patriarchal systems. Most people are realistically not going to be aware of more than 3 generations of family history, and even in the case that one's ancestors did do some bad things, judging people by the actions of those who lived before them is not a realistic standard. This is especially so if the claims or demands are being made by someone who themselves have not been directly impacted by the actions of one's supposed ancestor. But do you think that anyone is going to be doing this kind of digging before they start laying down the guilt? I seriously doubt it. The other thing about individuals belonging to groups like these is that very often they are not the kind of hive mind monolith that many folks act like they are. Examples of this in racialized contexts are where you have folks holding certain cultures of white people accountable for actions committed by entirely separate cultures, or demanding representation where it really doesn't make any sense, such as forgetting that, yes, amazingly, there are locations in the world to which white people are indigenous, and that they didn't just magically appear out of nowhere to oppress the poor innocent people of color. And I don't mean to use examples exclusively of white cultures, but this is just the kind of racial guilt that is currently most en vogue in the social justice world. But even more absurdly, we see similar kinds of guilt being applied to men, who represent an entire half of the population, as though they all feel the same way or secretly conspire against women. I find that to people who are not inundated with social justice ideas, the very notion of broad brushing an entire group like this just seems obviously silly. However, to people who look at the world through a feminist lens, a statement like this can seem banal and blasé to make. However, just imagine anyone with a straight face writing an article about male suicide rates or false allegations with a similar title smearing the entire female race as a whole. What kind of reaction would such an article get? I think we all know. Either way, unfortunately, this kind of guilt, that is, guilt by group membership, does seem to be the broadest kind in the social justice realm, and it can result in some pretty grotesque behavior, not even just from the oppressed groups towards the oppressor groups, but once a certain level of guilt is instilled, even within oppressor groups. For instance, people like this shining example of humanity using their child, who is obviously too young to understand such concepts, to broadcast their own guilt, and also to start training them in the ways of group membership guilt early. As a personal aside, as someone with a daughter not far from this age who even kind of looks like this little girl, I can't tell you how much this image makes me want to stab something. Moving on. So, another form of guilt that I commonly see in social justice is similar to the last category, but it refers more specifically to association with certain problems in society. This looks like assigning guilt to people because the guilt giver perceives the object of their scorn as having a hand in broader societal problems, usually if they are not actively working against them, and sometimes even if they are. Whether or not the individual of scorn finds these societal problems to be similarly distasteful is not always relevant. One common form this takes is the idea that you need to unlearn a certain behavior. Here's a good one we all know and love, the idea of internalized misogyny. Folks will say that you need to unlearn your internalized misogyny, and will then proceed to list a number of behaviors they perceive to fall under this category of behavior. Whether the person who supposedly needs to do the unlearning believes such behaviors constitute misogyny of any nature, or frankly, whether they even believe they display such behavior in the first place. What are some things that are evidence of internalized misogyny? I've had a few levied at me. Let's try being a pick-me, or not being like other girls, or how about actually being willing to hold women's feet to the fire? Now, for the first one, I don't believe I display that behavior at all, because I'm not just doing what I do for male approval, but because I think it's the right thing to do, and many other women do the same. And for the second one, I don't think that's internalized misogyny. In fact, I would argue the converse behavior, allowing women special forgiveness for certain behaviors you wouldn't allow for men, is far more misogynistic. Regardless, if you are not working to unlearn these behaviors, then you become part of the problem, and therefore worthy of guilt and shame. But anyway, for another example of this form of guilt, let's look at a statement like this one. It may take a while to comprehend your role in racist systems, but keep in mind that people are dying while they wait for you. Now, I very much doubt that someone who would say something like this would be satisfied merely by whoever they are directing this comment to saying, "But I think racism is a terrible thing," or "I do not believe I play a role in racist systems," or "Ma'am, this is a Wendy's." In fact, they would likely claim that ignorance of a problem or mere distaste is all the more evidence that you need to be doing more to challenge these problems in order to truly be free of guilt. Not that I have ever seen any such individual who makes this kind of statement be satisfied by any amount that a person could do to supposedly address their role in such systems, but that is essentially its own category. Let's go there now. Yet another flavor of guilt comes in, even when people are trying to buy into the social justice narrative and are taking actions to try to address their supposed roles in problematic systems or to unlearn certain problematic behaviors. But they're not doing enough. Or if they are doing anything, they're clearly not doing it for the correct reasons. A good example of this can be seen here. Have you centered any issues concerning racial injustice around yourself with a narrative about your own feelings? Understand that being an ally is not about you or your feelings. You have every right to feel anger, horror, fear, guilt, and sadness, but your job as an ally is to use those feelings to fuel your action. Expressing those feelings in hopes of gaining sympathy or comfort, especially from marginalized groups, is selfish and diminishes the issue itself. This is not about centering the social injustice around yourself.
Yo, we're going to tell you all of these horrible things that you, your kin, your ancestors, or even just people who vaguely look like you have done that have resulted in untold human suffering. We're going to fixate on nothing but this and hold it over your head forever. But do you think you're allowed to feel bad about this and want any kind of support for it? What are you, some kind of selfish asshole? This is not about you. How dare you even ask?
Or how about this little tidbit? Do you understand that the work of an ally doesn't stop, even when things get difficult? Being an ally is not supposed to be a comfortable and easy journey. Social injustices don't give marginalized groups a break when things get difficult. If you run into difficulties on your journey, just imagine what marginalized groups facing systemic and ongoing injustices feel. As mentioned in my altruism video, you rarely see any kind of appreciation for what other people are trying to do to improve themselves. Instead, there's almost always some flavor of negative attitude, ranging from, well, it's good you're doing this, but you can always do more, to whatever you do is still going to be tainted by the fact that you belong to the oppressor class, so it's on you to deal with that and be humble about it. Or even at the extreme end, you can never do enough to not be an insert bad label here. It's impossible. So, what is anyone supposed to do with that?
I wanted to have a more free-form discussion at the end of these sections so I could talk about some ideas that didn't neatly fit elsewhere. The first thing I wanted to note was that if any of this was really about challenging systems, as opposed to simply wanting to take pot shots at people belonging to the oppressor class, then you wouldn't see so much of this attitude of, your feelings don't matter, and we can't be expected to show you how to be a good ally, or other dismissive and divisive kinds of rhetoric. Rather, you'd be far more likely to see collaborative messages like, your feelings on this matter also because you're allowed to feel horrified at the atrocities that went down in the past. Even better because it drives a desire for change and equality now. Or, let's work together to create better systems that serve all of us. And of course we'll share what we want from you as allies, because how else are we going to know how best to support each other if we're not forthright about our needs? But it almost never seems to come across like that, does it? Weird.
Instead, we get things like gaslighting, Kafka traps, and obsessive fixating on the problems within the oppressor class, while minimizing any of their positives, and on the weaknesses of the oppressed class, while minimizing any of their strengths or even ways they may be contributing to their own problems. Also, it's curious how the kind of talk about people working to improve their own communities from within is never particularly in the spotlight. It's always about how everyone else needs to do the work to fix all the problems. The popular narrative these days is never, how can we all work together to solve these problems? It's, the privileged have to solve all the problems for us. Another thing worth noting is that I think that different levels or types of guilt will work on different kinds of people. With guilt trips like, you are complicit in problematic systems, but you can work to address this and become one of the good ones. This may attract some people who feel like such prescriptions can help them to be better people, or, to reference my earlier video, people who are more altruistic and who want to help others. You may think that more extreme claims like, you can never fully understand this social problem, and will always be a part of the problem and must always work to overcome it, would fail to attract anyone simply by virtue of their unrealistic demands, But then again, think of examples like, you can never fully be free from sin, but you can seek forgiveness from God. And suddenly it might not look quite so impossible. Another insidious element of all this is how ever more and more minimal behaviors are being targeted as problematic and worthy of guilt. It's one thing when someone dons a white robe and freely uses racial slurs, but it's another thing entirely to simply wear a certain kind of hairstyle or accessory, speak with a certain affectation, or use words that could potentially be perceived as offensive if you try really hard. It's even worse when people go combing through your history in some way to try to find something wrong or to get you to admit that you have done something wrong. Consider this example. Men do bad things to women. Excuse me, I haven't done bad things to women. Interesting. So you're claiming that every interaction with a woman that you've had in your life has been perfect so far. Well, I guess not exactly every single interaction has been perfect. Right, so you are complicit in this problem and have to work to be better. And by the way, good luck trying to challenge something like a demand to be better, because even if you successfully point out problems like the fact that it is so vague as to be a useless command, or that other people's perceptions of what better looks like may not be the same, they'll often just blink innocently at you and say, "What's wrong? Shouldn't everyone strive to be better in their lives?" You know, despite the fact that they're never calling for their own groups to be better, but hey. And don't even get me started on the kind of guilt that they will levy against people who supposedly belong to the oppressed class, but don't agree with their narrative. In those cases, the guilt will usually take on a very simplistic and even childish nature, often attempting to discredit or flat out insult whoever dares to go against the narrative.
Unfortunately, I think that overall the tactic of using guilt really doesn't do anything positive for anyone. For the target of the guilting, it either makes them feel badly about themselves or causes them to wall themselves off and become even more dismissive of the concerns of people who might indeed be struggling. For the people using the guilt, they may begin to see progressively more minimal behaviors as problematic and worthy of shame. It's certainly not likely to foster any empathy or a desire to work with the object of the guilt. Of course, I've addressed this in my divisiveness video already. By casting some people in the powerful circle and others in the marginalized circle, you're already training people to look at the differences between them in an adversarial manner, which feeds into strategies like using guilt and shame rather than finding methods of collaboration. Anyway, this is turning into a rather long video, so I think I'm going to wrap it up here. I have one more video that I intend to work on in this series, but I'm not going to promise that it'll be the next one I do. I think it's a big topic, and I think the right mindset will need to hit me in order to want to work on it. To be honest, I've been feeling a little extra pressure with various things going on in my life, so I might try to keep it a little on the lighter side for the next video or two. So that being said, thanks so much for watching, and I hope to see you all in the next one.